This is my true story. When I remarried, I took in a boy who wasn't my blood, but I treated him as my own. I raised him, supported him, and gave him everything I could. Years later, that same boy betrayed me in the worst way possible. I discovered he was having an affair with my ex-wife, turning my loyalty into humiliation. But what he didn't know was that I carried his darkest secret, and one day I would use it. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories. When I married again, I did not just take on a wife. I took on a boy who was not mine by blood, but became mine by choice. He was young, uncertain, and still trying to find his place in the world. I looked at him not as a burden, but as a chance to do what a man must, to guide, protect, and build a future for someone who needed it. I opened my arms to him and treated him as if he had always been part of my life. I never called him stepson in my heart. To me, he was my son, and I tried to make sure he never felt the absence of a father. I paid for his schooling when he struggled with fees. I helped him buy his first suit when he went for job interviews. I gave him rides when he needed them, stayed up late tutoring him through lessons he could not understand, and spoke to him about discipline, about honesty, about what it means to carry a man's name with pride. I made sacrifices silently, pulling from my savings to make sure his education was never cut short. I worked longer hours so he could go on trips with his friends and never feel lesser than those around him. When he landed his first job, I was the one who helped him prepare his resume, the one who stood behind him with advice, the one who reminded him to walk in with confidence. Even when he faltered, when he wasted money, when he failed in responsibilities, I did not scold him as an outsider would. I treated him as I would treat my own blood, with firm words, but with love. I gave him shelter when he had none. I gave him food when he had little. I gave him a place in my home, and more importantly, a place in my heart. My dream was that through effort and care, he would see me not just as the man who married his mother, but as the father who stood by him when he needed one most. I believed loyalty could be built even where blood was not shared. I believed that if I gave enough, he would see me as more than a provider. He would see me as a man worthy of respect. I thought the years of support, the countless sacrifices, the protection I gave to his name and his future would plant roots of gratitude that could not be shaken. When he stood tall in his first job, I was proud, not because he succeeded alone, but because I had been there to hold him up when he stumbled. When he bought his first car, I smiled, knowing I had been the one to co-sign the loan to make it possible. When he stood in the home I helped him secure, I felt fulfilled, knowing I had given him more than most fathers give their own children. I did all of this not because I expected repayment in money or in gifts, but because I believed that in return I would have something far more valuable: respect, loyalty, and love. I believed that when I grew older, when my body weakened and my years caught up with me, this boy-turned man would remember what I had done, that he would treat me with the dignity I had given him, that he would honor the sacrifices I made in silence. But what I thought would be loyalty turned into betrayal. What I thought would be respect turned into arrogance. And what I thought would be love turned into the deepest wound I would ever carry. As the years went by, I began to notice changes in him that I could not ignore. The boy I had once guided with patience and love started to grow into a man filled with arrogance. At first, it was subtle, small gestures that hinted at something darker beneath the surface. He would cut me off in conversations, roll his eyes when I spoke, or dismiss my suggestions as though my words held no weight. I tried to excuse it, telling myself he was young, that pride often blinds youth, that time and maturity would bring humility. But instead of softening, his behavior hardened, and the respect I once hoped for never came. The little things turned into open mockery. He began to laugh at my age, making cruel jokes about how slowly I walked or how long it took me to complete simple tasks. He would smirk when I struggled to carry heavy bags, offering no help, as if my weakness was a source of entertainment. Around his friends, he spoke of me not as the man who raised him, but as an old relic, someone outdated, someone clinging to a world long gone. His words cut deeper than he realized, because they were not just insults. They were reminders that he had erased all memory of what I had done for him. I noticed, too, the way he treated me in the home. He would sit at the table with arrogance, ignoring my presence, as if I were invisible. When his friends visited, he never introduced me as the man who raised him. Instead, he avoided acknowledgement altogether, as though ashamed to admit I lived under the same roof. The silence at those times was louder than any insult. It told me exactly how little he valued me. The greatest pain, however, was not the insults or the silence. It was the erasure of memory. Every sacrifice I had made, every night I had stayed awake worrying about his future, every coin I had saved to pay his fees, all of it vanished in his mind. He spoke as though he had built himself, as though he owed nothing to anyone, least of all me. I became not a father, not even a stepfather in his eyes, but an obstacle, a reminder of the past he wanted to forget. Through all of this, I chose silence. I could have confronted him, shouted back, reminded him of the countless times I had saved him from failure. But I held my tongue. Not because I was weak, but because I still believed in family. I told myself that bearing his disrespect in silence was better than causing a rift that could tear everything apart. I carried my pain quietly, convincing myself that one day he would realize the truth and come back with humility. But silence, I learned, is often mistaken for weakness. The more I endured without protest, the bolder he became. My authority meant nothing to him, my sacrifices meant less, and the respect I thought would come in time never arrived. Instead, he grew sharper, colder, more dismissive. It was as if every act of kindness I gave him had been transformed into fuel for his cruelty. The boy I had once called my son had become the man who now mocked me. And though I held my silence, deep inside, the wounds grew. Betrayal does not begin with one grand act. It begins with small cuts, each one slicing deeper, until the day comes when the bleeding cannot be ignored. I did not yet know that the worst cut of all was still waiting for me, a discovery that would tear open every wound at once. The moment that shattered what little faith I had left came like a knife to the chest, sharp and merciless. For years I endured his disrespect in silence, convincing myself that arrogance was temporary, that time would soften his heart. But then came the truth I never imagined. The truth that turned silence into fire. I discovered that my stepson, the boy I had raised as my own, was having an affair with my ex-wife. It began with whispers I could not ignore, strange phone calls late at night, sudden visits that did not make sense, and a tension in the air whenever they were in the same room. At first, I dismissed it, refusing to let my mind wander to such a dark place. After all, she had once been my wife, the woman I had shared years of my life with, and he was the boy I had lifted from nothing into a man. The idea seemed too cruel, too twisted to be true, but as the signs grew clearer, denial was no longer possible. The confirmation came one evening when I returned home earlier than expected. I heard voices behind a closed door, hushed, intimate voices not meant to be heard by me. My heart pounded as I listened, each word confirming what I had feared, the laughter, the whispers, the tone of two people bound by something forbidden. When the door opened and I saw them together, the betrayal stared me in the face. They froze, guilt written across their eyes, but the damage was already done. The pain that struck me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever known. It was not just the betrayal of a woman I had once loved. It was the betrayal of a son I had raised, a son who owed me loyalty, if not blood. It was as though they had conspired to erase me entirely, to humiliate me in a way that cut deeper than words ever could. My ex-wife had chosen to disrespect the years we once shared, and my stepson had chosen to stab me with the very hand I had once held up high. I felt mocked, humiliated, erased in my own home. Everything I had done for him, every sacrifice, every moment of love and protection, was spit upon with that one cruel act. The boy I had guided had not only disrespected me, he had invaded the most personal part of my life. And the woman who had once vowed loyalty to me had joined him in the betrayal. I could not eat that night. I could not sleep. I sat in silence, my mind replaying the moment again and again, each time cutting deeper. I thought of how the neighbors would laugh if they knew, how the relatives would whisper, how the world would see me as a fool. I thought of the years I had spent trying to protect the dignity of my family, only to have it destroyed from within. The humiliation was not only private, it threatened to become public, and that made it unbearable. Betrayal has many forms, but this was the cruelest of them all. It was not only betrayal of family loyalty, not only betrayal of love, it was betrayal of my very identity as a man, as a father, as a husband once. They had stripped me of dignity in the most intimate way possible, leaving me with nothing but silence and shame. That night, I understood something clearly. This was no longer about disrespect. This was war. After the night of discovery, I lived in silence that was heavier than chains. I still sat at the same table, but now every meal felt poisoned with humiliation. I would chew food without tasting it, my mind replaying the image of betrayal over and over. The faces of my stepson and my ex-wife haunted me in every corner of the house, like shadows that clung to my skin. When they looked at me, I could see not guilt or shame, but something worse: indifference. Their betrayal was not a mistake they regretted. It was a choice they justified. And the fact that they carried on without remorse deepened the wound in ways I cannot explain. I ate alone more often, sometimes by choice, sometimes because they would vanish together, leaving me to sit in the emptiness of my own home. I stared at the walls I had painted, the furniture I had bought, the very roof I had built, and felt like a ghost haunting my own life. It was not just betrayal of loyalty that hurt me. It was the deliberate attempt to erase me, to mock me in silence. They treated me as if I were invisible, as if my existence no longer mattered. At night, I lay awake in the dark, my chest heavy with grief. I thought of the years I had spent protecting my family's dignity, shielding them from the eyes of neighbors, providing a name that meant respect. Now that same name was being dragged through the dirt by the very people I had sacrificed for. I thought of how the world would view me if the truth came out. An old man made a fool in his own house, betrayed by both wife and son. The shame of it pressed harder than any weight I had ever carried. But humiliation has a way of transforming itself. At first, it broke me. I wept in silence, my tears soaking the pillow as I clutched it to my chest like a child. I asked myself how I had become so blind, how I had allowed this betrayal to grow under my own roof. I blamed myself for trusting too much, for loving too deeply, for protecting them when they did not deserve protection. Yet as the nights dragged on, something inside me began to harden. The tears dried, the grief turned to steel, the silence that once crushed me began to sharpen into resolve. I realized that their betrayal was not only personal, it was an attack on my manhood, on my dignity, on the years of sacrifice I had carried like armor. They thought they had humiliated me into silence. They thought their affair was hidden enough to keep me bound in shame. But they had underestimated the strength of a man who has already endured everything and has nothing left to lose. Each day, I carried the humiliation like a stone in my pocket, heavy but purposeful. It reminded me of what they had taken from me. And slowly, I began to see it not as a wound, but as fuel. The nights of grief were over. The days of quiet determination had begun. I told myself one truth that became my anchor. Betrayal demands justice, and humiliation must be answered. While they believed I was too broken to fight back, they forgot something important. I had lived long enough, seen enough, and carried enough silence to know things about my stepson that no one else did. He thought his betrayal began and ended with the affair, but in truth, that was only the surface. What cut deeper than his disloyalty as a son was the memory of the secrets he assumed I had forgotten. For years, I had looked the other way, keeping quiet to protect the family name. But betrayal has a way of changing the value of silence. I knew about his fraud, Long before the affair, I had stumbled across bank statements that didn't add up, documents filed with false numbers, loans taken under other people's names. At the time, I told myself it wasn't my place to ruin him. He was young, foolish, and I thought he would grow out of his mistakes if I protected him from the law. I kept the papers in a box, hidden away, like a shield over his recklessness. I carried the shame of his actions quietly, hoping time would change him. But fraud was only the beginning. I had seen money go missing from accounts that didn't belong to him, stolen in amounts that would have destroyed friendships if they were exposed. I knew of business partners he tricked, deals he made under false pretenses, signatures forged to line his pockets. I had read letters, overheard conversations, seen receipts that proved crimes buried under charm and arrogance. He had built an image of success, but underneath it all was theft, deceit, and manipulation. And all of it was written, recorded, documented. The kind of proof no amount of lies could erase. For years I justified keeping quiet. I told myself I was doing it for the family. I told myself exposing him would destroy my wife's peace, damage his future, and stain the name I worked so hard to build. I carried the burden of his crimes because I believed loyalty meant protection, even when it hurt. But the night I discovered his affair with my ex-wife, that loyalty shattered. The man I had protected had spit on my sacrifice. The boy I raised as my own had repaid me with humiliation. And suddenly, the weight of all those secrets I had carried for him no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a weapon. What he didn't know was that every crime he thought buried was still alive in my possession. I had the files, the receipts, the forged documents. I had evidence of every shady deal, every stolen fund, every fraudulent act. And now, for the first time, I no longer saw a reason to hide them. In fact, I saw the opposite. I saw justice waiting to be delivered. He thought he could humiliate me in silence. But silence, I realized, is only powerful when it hides the truth. And I no longer had any reason to protect him from the truth. Once the grief hardened into resolve, I knew what had to be done. Betrayal of the heart was one wound, but betrayal combined with crime was something else entirely. My stepson had laughed at me in silence, mocked my existence by lying with my ex-wife, and believed he had stripped me of dignity forever. But what he failed to realize was that I had the power to dismantle everything he had built. I would not strike him with anger, nor would I humiliate him with petty words. My weapon would be the truth, undeniable, documented, and sharp enough to cut through the illusions he had built around himself. The plan was simple in form, but heavy in weight. I would gather everything I had, the bank statements, the forged signatures, the receipts, the contracts with false numbers. I would organize the letters, the records, the proof that showed beyond doubt what he had done. For years these documents had sat hidden in a drawer, gathering dust, kept alive only by my misplaced loyalty. Now, that loyalty was gone, replaced by a father's fury cloaked in silence. I knew exactly what to do. Carry them to the one place where truth could not be ignored, the police station. I moved carefully, for betrayal had already taught me that arrogance makes men blind, but suspicion can make them dangerous. I did not let him suspect that I knew, that I was planning. I continued my days as quietly as before, eating at the same table, speaking in the same tone, showing no sign of the fire burning in my chest. While he believed I was broken, I was preparing. Each night, when the house grew silent, I opened the box of papers and spread them across my table. I read through every line, every figure, every false signature, and sorted them neatly into folders. Each document became a stone in the wall I was building against him. I also began writing down what I remembered. The conversations I had overheard, the dates I recalled, the names of the people he had cheated. My memory was long, and now I used it like a ledger, filling in the gaps that the papers alone could not explain. I knew that the law needed more than suspicion. It needed detail, it needed proof, and I had both. But more than collecting the evidence, I prepared myself. For years, I had carried humiliation in silence, bowing my head, avoiding confrontation. Now, I had to be firm, deliberate, and ready for the weight of confrontation with authority. I told myself over and over that this was not betrayal of him. This was justice for me. He had chosen betrayal when he crossed the line with my ex-wife. He had chosen shame when he mocked me in silence, and he had chosen destruction when he buried his crimes under lies. All I was doing was uncovering the truth he thought would remain buried forever. The plan was almost poetic in its simplicity. He believed I was powerless, too old, too weak to do anything but endure. But he had forgotten the power of patience. He had forgotten that silence can hide both weakness and strength. And now, with his betrayal cutting me open, my silence had transformed into strength sharper than any weapon. By the time the folders were neatly stacked and ready, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. I was no longer the humiliated man sitting in darkness. I was no longer the silent father swallowing disrespect. I was the witness, the keeper of truth, and the one preparing to end his arrogance with the only weapon he could not fight: the law. The morning I decided to act, the world felt strangely calm. The sky was gray, the streets were quiet, and yet inside me there was a storm ready to break. I had lived too many years swallowing humiliation, hiding truths, and carrying burdens that were never mine alone. But that morning, with the folder tucked under my arm, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The weight of betrayal no longer crushed me. It propelled me forward. I walked slowly but steadily to the police station. Each step reminded me of the years I had carried him, guided him, and shielded him. Each step also reminded me of the betrayal, the laughter, and the arrogance that erased all those sacrifices. By the time I reached the heavy glass doors of the station, I was no longer uncertain. I was resolved. Inside, the air smelled of paper, ink, and authority. Officers moved with quiet urgency, their boots echoing against the floor. I approached the front desk, my hands steady, and placed the folder on the counter. The officer looked at me with polite curiosity, asking what I needed. I told him simply that I had information about crimes, real crimes, committed by a man who thought himself untouchable. The officer raised an eyebrow but gestured for me to sit. Soon, I was led into a small room with a table, chairs, and a faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I opened the folder, spreading the documents neatly across the table. Bank statements with false entries, contracts with forged signatures, receipts that didn't match, letters that revealed secret dealings, proof stacked higher with each page. The officers leaned in, reading line after line, their faces tightening as they pieced together the web of lies my stepson had spun. I explained what I knew, the conversations I had overheard, the names he had tricked, the money he had stolen. My voice did not shake. My words did not falter. For the first time in years, I spoke with the authority of truth rather than the silence of shame. They asked me why I had waited so long. I told them the truth, because I had once seen him as my son, because I had once believed that protecting him meant protecting family. But family loyalty ends when betrayal begins, and betrayal ends when crimes demand justice. They listened, and they wrote, and they copied every document. When I had finished, I leaned back and spoke the line that had been burning in me since the night of discovery. He betrayed me as a son. Now let the law treat him as a criminal. The room went silent. The officer across from me nodded slowly, gathering the papers as though they were weapons in a war about to begin. He promised me an investigation, and I knew from the look in his eyes that it would not take long. When I left the station, the folder was gone from my hands, but the burden of years had gone with it. For the first time since the betrayal, I walked with my head high. I had chosen justice over silence, truth over humiliation. My stepson thought he had erased me, but I had just written the ending to his arrogance. The days after my visit to the police station unfolded like a storm gathering speed. At first, there was quiet, as though nothing had changed. My stepson still strutted with arrogance, still laughed with the same mocking tone, still believed he had the world in his hands. But beneath that surface, The wheels of justice were turning, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with him. The first sign came one morning when police vehicles pulled up outside our home. The sound of their engines shattered the stillness of the street, and neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering as uniformed officers stepped out. They carried files, warrants, and authority. My stepson came to the door, his confident smirk plastered on his face, but it faltered when the officers spoke his name and presented the papers. His voice rose in protest, his hands shook as he tried to argue, but the officers were unmoved. They searched the house, collected documents, and read out charges that painted his crimes in cold, undeniable detail. The neighbors gathered, their whispers growing louder. They had once looked at him with admiration, believing his success was self-made, that his wealth was proof of ambition. Now they saw the truth. A fraud, a liar, a man caught not just in betrayal of his family, but in betrayal of the law. Their stares cut him in ways my silence never could. He tried to shout, to deny, to act as though he were above them all, but with each passing minute, the arrogance drained from his face. And then it happened. The moment that turned his false pride into ashes. In front of the neighbors, in front of his wife, in front of the same people who once envied him, the police placed handcuffs on his wrists. The sound of metal locking shut was louder than any insult he had ever thrown at me. He twisted, he shouted, he begged, but the officers held firm. The world saw him not as the powerful man he pretended to be, but as a criminal dragged from his own home. His wife screamed, his friends vanished, his relatives hid in shame. The empire he had built on deceit crumbled in an instant. The same man who had mocked me at the table, who had laughed with my ex-wife behind closed doors, now stood begging in front of strangers, powerless and exposed. The humiliation I had endured in silence had finally returned to him, multiplied by the weight of the law and the eyes of the world. For me, there was no joy in his downfall, only justice. I did not cheer, I did not gloat, I did not throw his betrayal in his face. I stood in the doorway, watching silently as the police led him away, his head lowered, his pride gone. The neighbors turned to look at me, some with pity, some with respect, but I did not speak. My silence said enough. The man who betrayed me was now a prisoner of his own lies, and I was free of the weight I had carried for years. After the arrest, the house that once carried the weight of betrayal became filled with silence of a different kind. No more mocking laughter echoed through its halls. No more whispers between my ex-wife and my stepson lingered like poison in the air. The noise that had once humiliated me was replaced by the quiet of disgrace. My stepson's absence left a hollow space, but it was not emptiness. It was relief. For the first time in years, I felt the suffocating weight of betrayal lift from my chest. News of his crimes spread quickly. Relatives who once dismissed me as bitter or weak now stood shocked at the truth. They avoided my eyes at first, ashamed that they had believed his lies, but soon they returned with quiet respect, whispering that I had been right all along. Neighbors who once admired his arrogance now shook their heads when they spoke his name. The respect he thought he had earned collapsed overnight, and in its place grew whispers of shame that followed his every mention. His so-called friends vanished, distancing themselves as though he carried a plague. No one wanted to be tied to his fall. As for my ex-wife, she could not withstand the exposure. Her name, once tied to dignity through me, became tangled in scandal. The affair that had once been her secret was now her curse. She disappeared quietly, slipping away from the city, unable to bear the stares, the whispers, the judgment that followed her every step. She left behind nothing but silence and disgrace, vanishing as though she had never been part of this life at all. The empire my stepson had built on lies, deceit, and arrogance crumbled faster than I imagined. His accounts were frozen, his properties seized, his reputation destroyed. The businesses he had touched fell apart under investigation. Every fraudulent deal was exposed. Every partner he cheated turned their backs. Every false success stripped bare. What had taken years to build on lies was dismantled in days by the truth. I walked through those days not with triumph, but with peace. I did not celebrate his downfall because betrayal leaves no room for joy. It is not victory to watch your own child, even a stepchild, be destroyed. It is only justice. And justice, though cold, was enough. I no longer ate with grief clinging to me. I no longer slept with humiliation pressing against my chest. I was free, not because I had erased the betrayal, but because I had answered it with truth. The aftermath was not just about him, it was about me. For years, I had been silenced, mocked, humiliated in my own home. Now, I held my head high again. I was no longer the man hidden in the shadows of betrayal. I was the man who had faced it, exposed it, and survived it. The dignity that had been stripped from me was restored, not by apologies that never came, but by justice that could not be denied. When the dust finally settled, I sat alone with my thoughts, not in sorrow, but in peace. The betrayal had cut deep, but the truth had cut deeper, and it was the truth that carried me to justice. My stepson had mocked me, erased me, humiliated me, but in the end, it was his own arrogance that destroyed him. The same arrogance that led him to believe he could betray me without consequence blinded him to the fact that I had the power to end it all. And I did. Justice did not come with fists or shouting. It did not come with revenge in the shadows. It came with patience, with evidence, with the law. I had given him every chance to live with dignity, every opportunity to respect the sacrifices I made for him. He chose betrayal instead, and so I chose truth. By walking into that police station, by laying down the papers he thought buried forever, I reminded him and the world that silence is not weakness, and age is not powerlessness. A father, even a stepfather, always remembers. Now, as he sits behind bars, stripped of wealth, stripped of pride, stripped of the false image he wore like armor, I live free of the humiliation he once forced upon me. My ex-wife vanished into the shadows, her shame chasing her wherever she goes. The neighbors, the relatives, the community, they no longer see me as the man mocked in his own home. They see me as the man who stood for truth, who chose justice over silence, who reclaimed his dignity when betrayal tried to bury it. I do not regret what I did. Some might say I was harsh, that I should have stayed silent for the sake of family, for the sake of appearances. But loyalty has limits, and respect is the line that cannot be crossed. When betrayal comes, silence is no longer noble, it is foolish. And I was a fool for too long. No more. I did not just expose him for myself. I exposed him for every sacrifice that had been spit upon, for every moment of trust that had been betrayed. For every night I sat in humiliation wondering if my life had been wasted. By destroying the lies he lived on, I rebuilt the truth of who I am. A man not broken by betrayal, but strengthened by it. A man not silenced by humiliation, but sharpened by it. A man who understood that justice is not revenge, it is dignity restored. Final thought. He betrayed me in silence. I destroyed him with the truth. And in that truth, I found my peace.